At the age of 45, Tom Harrison learns that his daughter Emily, whom he raised alone after his divorce, has returned to Chicago, believing him to be dead. 2 years ago, as cancer ravaged his body, she abandoned him, leaving him alone with the disease. Now recovered, Tom discovers that Emily is claiming his house and savings. But the truth he uncovers shocks him even more and sets him on a fight for justice. Tom Harrison was 45 when the doctor's words hit him like a freight train. Lung cancer, stage 1. The sterile office in Chicago smelled of antiseptic and dread, but the diagnosis came with a silver lining. Caught early, it was treatable. He'd been a civil engineer for 2 decades, a man who built bridges and fixed problems, yet nothing prepared him for the fracture about to split his life apart. Sitting in his worn leather recliner that evening, he broke the news to his only daughter, Emily. At 23, she was the center of his world, the one he'd raised alone since his ex-wife, Laura, walked out 15 years earlier. The divorce had been mutual, a quiet unraveling of a love that fizzled out. Laura moved to Denver with a new boyfriend, leaving Tom with full custody of their 8-year-old daughter. Emily had been a tough kid, fiery, stubborn, and deeply hurt by her mother's abandonment. She never forgave Laura, refusing calls and letters, and Tom tried to fill that void. He worked overtime to pay for her dance classes, drove her to every recital, and skipped dating to avoid rocking her fragile world. "It's just us, kiddo," he'd say, ruffling her hair. She'd smile, and he'd feel like he'd won the lottery. That night, when he told Emily about the cancer, her hazel eyes welled up. She threw her arms around him, sobbing into his flannel shirt. "I'm not going anywhere, Dad. We'll fight this together," she promised. They cried, laughed through tears, and reminisced about her high school graduation, their annual camping trips to Lake Michigan, the time she burned a batch of cookies and set off the smoke alarm. For a moment, Tom felt invincible, bolstered by her love. But promises, he'd soon learn, could crumble faster than a house of cards. The first few months were grueling. Chemotherapy drained him, turning his sturdy frame gaunt and his sandy hair thin. Emily drove him to appointments at Northwestern Memorial, her old Toyota rattling through Chicago's traffic. She'd help him out of the car, steadying him as he shuffled inside. At home, he relied on her for everything, fetching water, handing him pills, even guiding him to the bathroom when his legs wobbled. He bought a wheelchair, hating every second he spent in it, but it kept him from collapsing. "You're my rock, Em," he'd whisper. She'd nod, but her smiles grew rarer. By month 6, something shifted. Emily's patience frayed. She'd snap when he asked for help, her voice sharp as a blade. "Can't you do anything yourself?" She stopped lingering in his room, retreating to her phone or the living room instead. Tom chalked it up to exhaustion. Caring for a sick parent wasn't easy, especially at her age. He didn't blame her. She was young, full of life, and he was a shadow of the dad she'd known. So, he hired Marta, a kind-eyed nurse with 20 years of experience, to ease the burden. Marta cooked, cleaned, and kept Tom's spirits up with bad jokes. Emily barely hid her disdain, muttering about strangers in our house. Then came the night that broke him. It was late, the house quiet except for the hum of the fridge. Tom, propped up in bed, called out for Emily to bring his meds. No answer. He waited, then called again. Silence. Painstakingly, he maneuvered into his wheelchair and rolled to her room. The door was ajar, her bed empty. On the nightstand sat a scribbled note. "I need space. Don't call me." His heart sank. He wheeled to the living room, peering out the window just in time to see her taillights vanish down the street, a suitcase in her trunk. For weeks, Tom was a ghost in his own home. Marta kept him alive, physically at least, but the loneliness gnawed at him. He'd raised Emily alone, poured every ounce of himself into her, and now she'd tossed him aside like a worn-out coat. He didn't know where she'd gone, and she didn't reach out. Friends said they'd heard she was taking a break in California, but no one had details. Tom fought the cancer alone, clinging to the hope she'd come back. The doctors were optimistic, the treatment worked, and slowly he rebuilt his strength. 2 years later, at 47, he was cancer-free, a miracle, they called it. He sold the house, a brick 2-story full of memories he no longer wanted, and moved into a modest apartment downtown. That's when the phone rang. It was his old neighbor, Jim, voice trembling with anger. "Some girl tried breaking into my place, your old house. yelling about her inheritance. Said her dad was dead. Tom, it was Emily. Tom's stomach dropped. Dead? Inheritance? He grabbed his keys and sped over, his mind racing. Emily thought he died, and she'd come back for his money. The betrayal stung, but a darker question loomed. Why was she so sure he was gone? Tom Harrison's pickup truck roared down Lakeshore Drive, the Chicago skyline a blur against the gray November sky. His hands gripped the wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles white as he replayed Jim's frantic call in his mind. Emily, his Emily, had shown up at the old house, pounding on the door, screaming about her inheritance. Jim, the new owner, had bought the place 6 months ago, a burly ex-cop with a no-nonsense streak. She looked feral, Tom, Jim had said. Kept yelling you were dead. What the hell's going on? Tom didn't have an answer, but the pit in his stomach told him this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. He pulled into the familiar street, the sight of his old brick 2-story twisting the knife in his chest. 2 years ago, he'd been a shell of himself here, chemo-ravaged and abandoned. Now, at 47, he was cancer-free, leaner but stronger, his hair growing back in uneven patches. He'd sold the house to start over, never imagining it'd pull him back like this. Jim stood on the porch, arms crossed, his wife, Kelly, hovering behind him with a phone in hand. A small crowd of neighbors lingered across the street, whispering and pointing. No sign of Emily yet. She took off when I threatened to call the cops. Jim grunted as Tom climbed out of the truck. But she said she'd be back. Kept ranting about how this was her house, and we stole it from her dying dad. You didn't tell me your kid was unhinged, man. Tom winced. I didn't know she thought I was dead. She left 2 years ago, right in the middle of my treatment. Haven't heard from her since. He scanned the yard, half expecting her to leap out from the bushes. What did she look like? Kelly stepped forward, her voice soft but shaky. Thin, wild hair, like she hadn't slept in days. She had a key, tried the lock, but we changed it. When it didn't work, she lost it, started banging on the door, screaming we were thieves. I opened it to calm her down, and she shoved me. Said I was squatting in her dad's grave. Tom's jaw tightened. The Emily he'd raised was impulsive, sure, but never violent. Something was off, way off. I'm sorry she dragged you into this, he said. I'll handle it. If she comes back, call the police. I'll deal with the fallout. Jim nodded, but his eyes narrowed. You'd better. I don't need some psycho trashing my place. Tom promised to keep them posted and drove off, his mind a storm of questions. Emily hadn't just left. She'd erased him. Dead? How could she think that? He hadn't spoken to her, hadn't posted online, hadn't even told mutual friends much beyond, I'm better. Had she assumed the worst, or wanted it? 2 hours later, he was nursing a coffee at a diner when his phone buzzed. Jim again. She's back, Tom. Brought a couple of punks with her this time. They're in the yard, yelling threats. Cops are on the way, but you'd better get here. Tom slammed cash on the table and bolted. By the time he arrived, blue lights flashed against the dusk, and 2 officers were cuffing a scruffy guy with tattoos snaking up his neck. Another girl, barely 20, stood by a beat-up sedan, arguing with a cop. And there, on the lawn, was Emily, pale, disheveled, her eyes blazing with fury. She froze when she saw him step out of the truck. The air thickened, time slowing as their gazes locked. Dad, her voice cracked, barely a whisper. Then louder, shrill, you're alive? How, what the hell? She stumbled forward, but an officer grabbed her arm. Let go. That's my father. Tom's chest ached, a mix of relief and rage. Yeah, eminencia. I'm alive. No thanks to you. He turned to the cops. I'm Tom Harvison. This is my daughter. I used to own this house, sold it last year. She doesn't belong here. Emily's face twisted. You sold it? You sold my house. I thought you were dead. I came back for what's mine, and you're just standing there. She lunged, but the officer held her back. You liar. You let me think you were gone. I didn't let you think anything. Tom snapped, his voice cutting through her hysterics. You walked out. Left me when I could barely walk. Where were you, huh? What's this dead bullshit? The neighbors gawked, and Jim shook his head from the porch. Emily's defiance faltered, her eyes darting to her companions, now silent, shrinking under police scrutiny. I heard you weren't going to make it, she stammered. Someone told me. Who? Tom pressed, stepping closer. Who told you I was dead? She hesitated, lips trembling. It doesn't matter. I came back to fix things, okay? I didn't know. But her tone was hollow, rehearsed. Tom's gut screamed she was lying. The cops loosened their grip, waiting for his lead. He could press charges, trespassing, assault on Kelly, but he needed answers first. Take her in for questioning, he told the officer. I'll follow. Emily's protests faded as they led her to the squad car. Her friends scattered, the sedan peeling out. Tom watched, heart pounding. She hadn't come to fix things. She'd come for money for the house, thinking he was a corpse to cash in on. But that story about someone telling her he died, that was the thread he'd pull. Because if Emily didn't act alone, someone else had a hand in this, and he'd find them. Tom Harrison sat in the dim glow of a Chicago police station waiting room, the stale smell of burnt coffee and linoleum clinging to the air. His hands fidgeted with a crumpled receipt, folding and unfolding it as he replayed Emily's words. Someone told me you were dead. Her voice had quivered, her eyes darting like a cornered animal's. She'd always been a lousy liar, ever since she was a kid, sneaking cookies and blaming the dog. Now, at 25, she was tangled in something bigger, and Tom needed to know what. The clock ticked past 9 p.m., each second stretching his nerves thinner. Inside an interrogation room, Emily sat across from a detective, her arms crossed, jaw set. Tom had declined to join. Watching through a one-way mirror felt too invasive, too final. But he'd given the cops the basics, her abandonment during his cancer fight, her sudden return, the trespassing. He'd asked them to dig into her story, and they'd agreed, sensing more beneath her tantrum. An officer emerged, a stocky guy named Ruiz, and waved Tom over. She's talking. Not much, but enough to raise eyebrows. You sure you want to hear this? Positive, Tom said, voice steady despite the storm in his chest. Ruiz led him to a cramped office, shutting the door. She claimed she left because she couldn't handle the stress of your illness. Says she moved to L.A. with a boyfriend, some guy named Derek. According to her, he's the one who told her you didn't make it. Said he heard it from a friend about a year ago. She believed him, cut ties, and only came back now because Derek dumped her and she's broke. Tom's brow furrowed. Derek? She never mentioned a boyfriend when she was with me. And who's this friend he heard it from? I didn't die, obviously. No one I know would spread that. Ruiz Chirag. That's where it gets shaky. She's vague on details. Says she doesn't know the friend's name. Just took Derek's word for it. Sounds like bullshit to me. We're running her phone records and Derek's name through the system. If he's got a record, we'll find him. He paused, studying Tom. She's asking for you. Wants to explain. Your call. Tom hesitated. Part of him wanted to storm in, demand the truth, every ugly piece of it. But another part, the one still raw from her betrayal, warned him to keep distance. Not yet, he said. Let her stew. I need more than her word. That night, alone in his apartment, Tom couldn't sleep. Emily's face, pale, defiant, haunted him. He poured a glass of bourbon and paced, memories crashing in. She'd been his world, his loud, messy, brilliant girl. He'd taught her to ride a bike, cheered at her dance recitals, held her when Laura left. Where had he gone wrong? Or had he? Maybe this wasn't about him at all. By 2 a.m., he'd made a decision. He'd hire someone to dig deeper. The cops were a start, but he needed answers faster. The next morning, he met with a private investigator named Carla Vega, a sharp woman in her 30s with a no-nonsense vibe. Over coffee at a Loop diner, he laid it out. Cancer, Emily's exit, her return, the dead story. Carla scribbled notes, her dark eyes narrowing. Sounds like she's either delusional or someone fed her a line. I'll track this Derek down. LA's big, but people leave trails. Give me a week. 3 days later, Carla called. Got something. Derek Malone, 28, small-time grifter with a rap sheet. Petty theft, fraud. He and Emily were living in a rundown apartment in Echo Park. Neighbors say he's a charmer. Convinced her he'd take care of her. Here's the kicker. He's been asking around about you for months. Not just if you were alive, about your money, your house. One guy said Derek bragged he'd score big once you were gone. Tom's blood ran cold. He knew I was sick? Seems so, Carla replied. He might have had a source, someone who knew your situation. I'm cross-checking his contacts. But there's more. Emily's been posting online cryptic stuff about losing everything and claiming what's hers. She stopped a year ago, right when Derek supposedly told her you died. I think he played her, Tom. Convinced her you were toast, so she'd stay out of the way till he could swoop in. The pieces clicked, sharp and jagged. Derek hadn't just lied. He manipulated Emily, preyed on her impulsiveness. But who fed him the intel? Tom's circle was small, Neighbors, a few work buddies, his doctors. No one with a motive to fake his death. Unless Laura, his ex-wife, flickered into his mind, a ghost from 15 years back. She'd never cared about Emily after leaving, but could she have tracked him? Resented him enough to meddle? He called Carla back. Check Laura Harrison. My ex lives in Denver, last I knew. See if she's linked to this Derek guy. Carla agreed, and Tom hung up, adrenaline surging. Emily might have been a pawn, but she'd still chosen to believe the worst, to abandon him for a conman's promises. Anger simmered, but so did resolve. Whoever orchestrated this, he'd expose them. Not for revenge, for the truth. Because if there was one thing cancer taught him, it was that lies fester worse than any disease. Tom Harrison stood outside his Chicago apartment, the late November wind biting through his jacket as he stared at the phone in his hand. Carla Vega's latest update echoed in his ears. Laura's clean. No ties to Derek we can prove. But I found something else. Derek's been talking to a guy named Paul Grayson, your old neighbor from 3 doors down. They've been texting for months. Paul. The name hit like a punch. Paul had lived on their street for years, a quiet retiree who'd always wave hello. He'd known Tom was sick. Hell, he'd even dropped off a casserole once. Why would he feed lies to a grifter? Carla's voice cut through his days. Paul's got no record, but he's broke, lost his savings in a bad investment. Derek might have promised him a cut to keep tabs on you. How about screenshots of their chats? One says, once the old man's gone, she'll sign it over. They were banking on Emily inheriting everything. Tom's grip tightened. Paul had watched him waste away, knowing Emily was gone, and sold him out. For what money? Revenge? It didn't matter. The betrayal fueled him. He met Carla that afternoon at her cramped office downtown, papers strewn across her desk. She slid a folder toward him. Phone logs, texts, even a grainy photo of Derek meeting Paul in a parking lot. This is enough for a case, she said. Fraud, conspiracy to defraud, maybe defamation if you push it. Emily's a wild card. She might have been duped, but she still acted on it. Trespassing's already on her sheet. What's your move? Tom didn't hesitate. I'm suing them. Derek, Paul, and Emily if she's in on it. I want this public. Let them explain it to a judge. Carla nodded, a glint of approval in her eyes. Smart. Keeps it legal. Hits him where it hurts. I'll connect you with a lawyer. This'll take time, though, months, maybe a year. Tom didn't scare Tom anymore. Cancer had taught him patience, and this fight felt cleaner, purer than the disease ever had. He hired a lawyer, a wiry guy named Mark Ellis, who pored over Carla's evidence and filed the suit within a week. Derek Malone, Paul Grayson, and Emily Harrison were named in a civil case for fraud and emotional distress, with a criminal complaint for conspiracy sent to the DA. Word spread fast. Neighbors whispered, local news picked it up, and Tom's phone buzzed with calls he ignored. He wasn't hiding anymore. Months crawled by, the case building as winter thawed into spring. Derek dodged summons, but the cops tracked him to a dive bar in L.A. and hauled him back. Paul lawyered up, claiming he'd only passed rumors, but his texts betrayed him. Emily, released after her trespassing arrest, went quiet, holed up somewhere in Chicago, refusing Tom's attempts to talk. Mark warned him she might counter-sue, play the victim, but Tom didn't flinch. Let her try, he said. I've got nothing left to lose. The trial hit in July, a muggy courtroom packed with reporters and curious locals. Tom sat in a stiff suit, his palms sweaty as Mark laid out the case. Derek's con, Paul's betrayal, Emily's reckless belief. Carla testified, her evidence airtight, screenshots, timelines, witness statements from L.A. neighbors. Derek took the stand, slick and smug, claiming he'd misunderstood Tom's condition, but he tripped over his lies, sweat beading on his brow. Paul fidgeted, mumbling excuses about helping a friend, his story crumbling under cross-examination. Emily's turn came last. She walked in, thinner than Tom remembered, her eyes red-rimmed. She didn't look at him, staring at the floor as she spoke. I didn't know Dad was alive. Derek said he'd checked, said it was over. I was stupid, okay? I trusted him. Her voice broke, tears spilling. I came back to fix things, not steal. I didn't mean, she choked off, and the room hushed. Tom's chest tightened. Was she sorry, or just sorry she got caught? The jury watched, stone-faced. Mark leaned over. She's good, might sway them. But the evidence doesn't lie. She still acted on it. Signed papers Derek forged. That's on her. Tom nodded, his resolve hardening. He took the stand next, voice steady as he recounted it all. Cancer, abandonment, the shock of her return. I raised her alone, he said, eyes on the jury. Gave her everything. She left me to die and came back for my money. That's not a mistake, it's a choice. The courtroom buzzed as he stepped down. Emily sobbed quietly. Derek glared, and Paul shrank in his seat. Closing arguments dragged, but Tom felt lighter, like the truth, finally spoken, had unburdened him. The jury deliberated for 2 days, an eternity of pacing and black coffee. When they returned, the foreman stood. We find the defendants liable for fraud and emotional distress. Damages awarded, $150,000. A murmur rippled through the room. Derek cursed under his breath. Paul blanched. Emily just stared, hollow. Tom exhaled, the weight lifting. It wasn't about the money. He'd donate most of it. It was about accountability. Outside, reporters swarmed, but he waved them off. Émilie approchait, tentative. Dad, Adi cut her off? Save it. You made your bed. He walked away, the sun warm on his face. Justice wasn't revenge, it was closure, and he was ready for what came next. Tom Harrison stepped out of the Chicago courthouse into the July heat, the weight of the trial verdict settling like a quiet tide. The jury's ruling, $150,000 in damages from Derek, Paul, and Emily, echoed in his mind, but it wasn't the money that mattered. He'd already decided to donate most of it to a cancer support charity, a small way to turn his pain into something good. At 47, he felt older than his years, but lighter too, like the shadow of betrayal had finally lifted. The reporters lingered, shouting questions, but he slipped past them, craving silence. The days after the trial blurred into a strange calm. Derek Malone, the slick con man, faced criminal charges, fraud and forgery, that could land him behind bars. Paul Grayson, the neighbor who'd sold Tom out, pleaded out to avoid jail, but the fine wiped his savings clean. Emily, she was the hardest to process. Her tearful courtroom plea replayed in Tom's head. I didn't mean it. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe she'd been a pawn in Derek's game. But she'd still chosen to believe him, to abandon Tom when he needed her most. That cut wouldn't heal, not yet. He moved through his routine, coffee at the diner, walks along the lakefront, trying to figure out what came next. The apartment felt too small, too tied to the past. One evening, sorting mail, he found a letter from Emily. No return address, just her shaky handwriting. Dad, I'm sorry. I was lost, stupid. Derek twisted everything. I know you hate me, but I'm trying to fix myself. I won't ask for anything, just wanted you to know. He stared at it, torn between crumpling it and keeping it. In the end, he tucked it into a drawer. Forgiveness wasn't his to give yet. A week later, Carla Vega called. Loose ends tied up, she said. Derek's singing to cut a deal. Admits he targeted Emily because she was easy to sway. Paul was his eyes, feeding him updates on your health. They thought you'd die. She'd inherit, and they'd split it. Laura's still out of the picture. No evidence she knew. Tom thanked her, the final puzzle piece clicking. It was greed, pure and simple. Emily hadn't masterminded it, but she'd let it happen. That was her burden now. The clarity sparked something in him. He'd spent years living for Emily, raising her, shielding her, sacrificing his own happiness. Cancer had stripped him bare, and her betrayal had nearly broken him. But he'd survived both. Why not start over? He called a realtor, put the apartment up for sale, and booked a one-way ticket to Portland, Oregon. A friend from college lived there, promising craft beer and hiking trails. It felt right, a clean slate. In Portland, Tom found a small house near the Willamette River, its porch perfect for morning coffee. He started running again, slow at first, his lungs protesting but growing stronger. The city's quiet energy soothed him. No skyscrapers, just trees and rain. At a local coffee shop, he met Alice Carter, a 45-year-old teacher with warm eyes and a quick laugh. She'd lost her brother to cancer years back, and they bonded over shared scars. You're tougher than you look, she teased one day, handing him a latte. He smiled, his first real one in months. Their friendship grew, unhurried. Alice dragged him to art fairs. He taught her to grill a decent steak. 6 months in, she asked about Emily. Tom told her everything, the good years, the bad, the trial. Alice listened, then squeezed his hand. You didn't fail her. She failed you. But you're here now, that's what counts. Her words sank in, loosening a knot he hadn't known was there. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. Back in Chicago, Emily faced her reckoning. The civil damages drained her savings, money she'd scraped from odd jobs after Derek left her. Community service followed, 200 hours cleaning parks, a humbling fall from her reckless dreams. She wrote Tom again, a longer letter about therapy, sobriety, a job at a salon. "I don't expect you to write back," it ended. "Just hope you're okay." He didn't reply, but he kept it. Maybe one day he'd reach out. Maybe not. A year after the trial, Tom stood on a Portland trail, Alice beside him, the forest alive with birdsong. His phone buzzed, a news alert. Derek's sentencing. 3 years, no parole. Paul's house was foreclosed, his name mud in their old neighborhood. Justice had rolled out, slow but sure. Tom pocketed the phone and looked at Alice. "Feel like celebrating?" She grinned. "Only if there's pie involved." That night, over cherry pie and whiskey, Tom raised a glass. "To new beginnings," he said. Alice clinked hers against it. "To earning them." He laughed, the sound free and full. The legacy he'd fought for wasn't a house or money. It was his own life reclaimed. Emily, Derek, Paul, they'd faced their consequences, but Tom was done carrying their weight. The past was a shadow, fading in the light of a future he'd built himself.